President Trump listening to the voices of South Africans, some of whom are his good friends, like those who are here. When we have talks between us on the around a quiet table, it will take President Trump to listen to them. I'm not going to be repeating what I've been saying. I would say if there was Afrikaner farmer genocide, I can bet you these three gentlemen would not be here.
All right. Welcome back to This Week in Africa, your weekly live stream where we go through the news of the day and we ensure that you are up to speed on what's happening in Pan-African news around the world. I am your co-host, Joe Hatagwa, and I will turn it over to my co-host and we'll do some introductions before we get started on today's stories.
Hello, my name is Gloria Ayo. I am the creator of The African Story, and I am very happy to be back.
Absolutely. And I am Joe Hatagwa, founder of Authentic African, website where we make handmade, ethically sourced products made in Africa available to the diaspora, and also the platform where we try to bridge the gap between Africans living on the continent and living in the diaspora, with the goal of getting people to visit, invest, and or move to the continent of Africa, despite its challenges with the internet and light. So with that, if you guys can hear us, give us a thumbs up. Let us know that you can hear us. And today's story, as you know, is Trump's lies about white genocide in South Africa and his fight with Ramaphosa at the White House. So before we get into more of that video that Gloria so graciously edited for us so that we could get the highlights of it, I do want to give some context and some insight into what has transpired over the last 24 hours. We're going to watch the rest of that video, and then we're going to give some commentary on the other side. So first things first, let's start with just some key highlights from the Ramaphosa-Trump meeting. So the meeting between Donald Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa at the White House was marked by Trump confronting Ramaphosa with claims that white farmers are, quote unquote, fleeing from South Africa due to what he calls violence and what he also termed a genocide against white South Africans. So Trump presented videos and news reports. Okay. He presented videos to support his assertions. However, Ramaphosa firmly rejected the idea that there is a systematic prosecution or persecution of government policy targeting white South Africans, emphasizing that such incidents are not state sanctioned. Elon Musk, a South African-born businessman, and of course Trump advisor, and not just advisor, but investor in his campaign, or donor, I should say, in his campaign, attended but did not participate in the discussion. Trump had previously echoed similar claims, though these have been widely discredited. So prior to this meeting, Trump had mentioned that he was not likely to attend the G20 summit, which is supposed to be in South Africa. So, also there were trade relations that were discussed in this particular meeting, particularly focusing on South Africa's 30% tariffs on certain goods. Ramaphosa sought to address what he called misrepresentations of South Africa and to pursue new trade agreements. There was also discussion of the Ukrainian war. There was also the additional discussion of the ICC case against Israel. The leaders briefly discussed the International Criminal Court's investigation into Israel for alleged war crimes. So just really quickly, fact-checking Trump's claims before we get into this video. First of all, Trump's assertion of a genocide against white farmers in South Africa is not supported by any available evidence anywhere. Multiple sources confirm that while violent crime is a serious problem in South Africa, the murders of white farmers constitute a very small fraction of the country's overall homicide rate. So official statistics throw out that nearly 20,000 homicides are recorded between April and December of 2024 last year. Only 36 of them were were associated with farms or small agricultural properties, and just 7 victims were actual farmers. Most victims in farm-related killings are actually Black farm workers. Now, there's much more to go through, but I will go through that after we watch the video. We can get into the video and give some more commentary on the other side. Okay.
News stories.
Yes, Honorable Member. It must never be smart that at some point there must be killing, because the killing is part of a revolutionary act. Shoot to kill. No, sir. Kill the poor.
Where that is, Mr. President.
Over 1,000
I'd like
of
to
white farmers, and those cars are lined up to pay love on a Sunday morning. Each white farmers, the family of white farmers. And those cars aren't driving, they're stopped there to pay respects to their family member who was killed.
Mr. President, accepting a Qatari jet to be used as Air Force One, perhaps.
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about?
You know,
The Pentagon.
you gotta get out of here. What does this have to do with the Qatari jet? It's NBC trying to get off the subject of what you just saw.
I'll ask
You
you
are
about
a
that.
real, you're a terrible reporter.
ask you if-
Number one, you don't have what it takes to be a reporter. You're not smart enough. But
Thank
for
you,
you
sir.
to go into a subject about a jet that was given to the United States Air Force, which is a very nice thing. They also gave $5.1 trillion worth of investment. Brian Roberts and the people that run that place, they ought to be investigated. And you're a disgrace. No more questions for me. Look, these are articles over the last few days. Death of people. Death. White South Africans are fleeing because of the violence and racist laws. Burial sites all over the place. These are all white farmers that are being buried. And he asks about a jet that was given. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Worse. And these are people that are officials, and they're saying that kill the white farmer and take their land. And I have other friends in South Africa. I have people that left. One in particular that says you can't go there. He said they want to take your land. They take your land and they kill you.
In many cases, or in some cases, those policies do not go along with government policy.
But you do allow them to take land.
No.
You do allow them to take land.
Nobody can
And then
take
when
land.
they take the land, and when they kill the white farmer, nothing happens.
Oh, Ramaphosa. Anyway, Gloria, please give your thoughts before I give mine. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this exchange and the overall topic that was presented in this discussion.
I really want to hear your thoughts, to be honest. But yeah, land has been central to South Africa's history. Let's just dive into history, because I'm quite exhausted talking about this, but I mean, we have to keep talking about it because Trump keeps talking about it. So we have to keep talking about it. After the Dutch colonized South Africa from 1652, and of course, later on the British, a lot of land was seized from indigenous African communities. And that was actually backed with the law. The law enabled them to use force to take land away from the indigenous Africans. The 1913 Natives Act, or Natives Land Act, which I actually talked about, I repurposed that content. I talked about it when, I think sometime in February, when this whole talk of taking over or white farmers being killed and their land being taken from them kind of resurfaced, because it's been happening before. It's not the first time Trump will talk about this. Now, in 1913, the Natives Land Act, it codified this dispossession, which ended up restricting Black South Africans from owning land outside certain native reserves. So just about 7% of the country's territory, for over 80% of the population, 80% having to deal with just 7% of the land. By the time apartheid ended in 1994, the economic structure remained intact. a white minority still controlled the vast majority of arable land, and that's still going on. And then on the other hand, the Black majority remained landless, they're economically marginalized, they're spatially segregated. In spite of the fall of apartheid, land ownership still remains skewed. So over 70% of agricultural land is still owned by white South Africans, who comprise less than 10% of the population, I think between 7 and 8, something like that. Now, Ramaphosa's ANC government has long promised to address this imbalance, but there's been very little progress. In 2018, they announced plans to actually start expropriating without compensation, and they framed it as a corrective measure to help address historical injustice. But some people, especially in Western outlets, see it as a threat to property rights. Trump has been claiming since 2018, when he was actually in power the first time, he's been claiming that this has been going on, or that land is being taken away and people are being killed. Matter of fact, he tweeted the Secretary of State to study South Africa's land seizures and even referenced the large-scale killing of farmers. He was in power back then, and he inflamed this narrative that white South Africans were under attack. Now, there have been multiple studies, as we've said repeatedly on this show, including those from South African police and independent researchers, that there is no such thing. The so-called receipts that Trump showed have been debunked by even major news outlets, Sky News. I saw all kinds of, even Western media, Sky News, of course, is Western, but I saw even Western media debunking it, because they said even the owner of that, what was it? He said the bodies that were being buried or something like that, or they came out to mourn their loved ones that were killed. It was such a long queue. They said, no, it wasn't. That was actually for, I think, a couple that happened to get killed. They were, farmers, but it wasn't racially targeted, because Blacks get targeted far more. Yeah. And so it's not a thing by virtue of, I guess, the population. Blacks are actually bigger victims of the crime rate in South Africa, which I've said before on my platform, that South Africa is where it is because of this same injustice. The crime rate is high because of the marginalization of the indigenous Africans. Now, Ramaphosa meeting Trump at the White House, I knew it was a bad idea. I remember thinking, oh Lord, he's walking into the lion's den, and into the lion's den he went. Many expected, even in spite of our concerns, that he would at least use the opportunity to firmly explain South Africa's position and help correct this very misleading narrative. And this would have also been a great opportunity to educate global audiences about how deep inequality goes. But that did not happen. I don't know if it was diplomatic caution. I don't know if it was him, strategically hesitating, but his failure, his inability to clearly assert the historical context of land reform left a vacuum that Trump jumped right into. And that was not a good look for the entire continent, because it's time for our leaders to start, portraying us with dignity, like a Kwame Nkrumah would have done, a Thomas Sankara would have done. It's not enough for you to govern people. You need to be able to tell our stories effectively. And as much as Ramaphosa was very calm, he was very composed. Matter of fact, some people praise him for that. Thank you for being calm and composed and diplomatic, but that wasn't a good look for Africa. Because Trump, if there were judges, if there was a panel of judges, Trump actually won that argument, even though you would have argued on the side of truth and facts, but you gave it to Trump. Right. I don't know why. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, look, I think to your point about him, capitulating, I think it's because, he's trying to get this 30% tariff removed. Right. And so, that when it comes to Trump, you have to play to his ego. Right. You have to stroke his ego. You saw what happened when Zelensky was in the White House and, he pushed back a little bit. You saw how that conversation went. And so that's something you have to do in private with Trump. You can't do that in public. But But I will say that even still, though, it's important for him to fact check even calmly and politely, because he looked like he didn't know what was going on. You know, Julius Malema, by the way, is a very, very popular political figure outside of South Africa. You know, obviously he didn't win the presidency during the last election. Ramaphosa was reelected. And, you know, yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, that video was from, I think his political parties, it was an anniversary, I think it was. And they did the song that they normally do, the Shoot the Boer, whatever it's called. And I think it's a symbolic song. It's largely symbolic. But when that happened, I remember Elon Musk tweeting Ramaphosa and saying, you need to do something about this, right? And I think at that point in time is when he probably put it on Trump's radar. And that's when these kinds of conversations were happening. Now, to the point of genocide, let's be very specific. The United Nations definition of genocide requires intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. There is no credible evidence that South Africa's government or society is engaged in or condoning any actions such as genocidal actions of anything we just mentioned to white South Africans. South African courts and major political factions have also refuted the notion of white genocide, calling those claims not real, quote unquote, clearly imagined. So as you mentioned, the land expropriation law, Trump referenced the South African law permitting land expropriation without compensation, suggesting it targets white farmers. In fact, the law allows expropriation under specific conditions, in some cases abandoned or underutilized land, and it applies to landowners apparently of any race. So as of mid-May 2025, no land had been seized under this law. So claims that white South Africans are being killed as a result of land seizures are not substantiated by any evidence, and there's no such land expropriations that have even occurred to date as of yet. And so for him to be calling it a genocide, when, by the way, there are real genocides happening around the continent of Africa, let's not even talk about around the world, but even on the continent of Africa as we speak. But as we talked about this the other week, he said it doesn't matter about race, but he was the one who also continues to say white South Africans, racist. He uses the word racist. He uses the word genocide to describe it because it's against people who look like him, right? So this goes a step further beyond this particular conversation at the White House, where obviously I think Ramaphosa did a horrible job of making the point that this is not true. I mean, as the president of the country, who also is a multiple business owner, you would think that he'd have some talking points prepared to discuss. It's not your first time speaking in front of an audience maybe of this size, but right. Also you would have got a chance to study how this man talks to people. He will steamroll you. All you need to do is just come with your points and say them politely, so that at the very least, what you say is on record. Because what he said on record was about a lot of gibberish. Like his responses to what Trump said did not actually come with any real fact or any ability for those who are watching to know that a genocide is not actually happening. Trump clearly made it look like there actually was one, and many people walked away thinking that there is one. Not people who are watching this content here, but this is a small subset of the people who watch that particular press conference. And it was played on the news across all major news outlets. So with that, I do want to move next to a tense exchange on the Senate floor where Senator Tin Kaine pressed now Secretary of State Marco Rubio over his claims that Afrikaners face greater persecution than other groups. Kaine questioned the basis of Rubio's argument, highlighting the lack of clarity. With 49 individuals okay, so he said, what land did they leave behind? Was it reclaimed by the government, taken by other South Africans? There was a lot of questions that were asked, but I think the main question that was asked was about this being a genocide. And it's interesting to hear how Marco Rubio responds to this. So we'll watch this video and have some commentary on the other side.
Farmers are the most persecuted group in the world.
I think those 49 people that came certainly felt they were persecuted, and they passed every sort of check mark that had to be checked off in terms of meeting the requirements for that. They live in a country where farms are taken and land is taken on a racial basis.
Okay. Do you think they're more persecuted than Uyghurs or Rohingyas, or more persecuted than political dissidents in Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, or more persecuted than those who would be threatened should they be returned to Afghanistan by violence by the Taliban?
Well, the problem we face there is the volume problem, okay? If you look at all the persecuted people of the world, it's millions of people. They can't all come here. And we had refugee programs.
So why prioritize Afrikaner farmers?
Well, because it's a small subset. It's a new issue, and the president identified it as a problem and wanted to use it as an example. But that's different from having these refugee programs that were basically spending money to put people up in communities and accommodate them, and it was acting as a magnet. Millions of people in this country illegally, and today the border is sealed.
Let me challenge you, and I'm just going to say for the public, if you want to understand about the, quote, persecution of Afrikaner farmers, go look at the composition of the South African government. Since July of 2024, there's a government of national unity, and the opposition party to the ANC, the Afrikaner Party, the Democracy Alliance, is part of the governing coalition. They joined the governing coalition a year ago, and the leader of that party was given the remit of Agriculture Minister, John Steenhuisen. He is the leader of the former Afrikaner Party, still widely representing Afrikaners. He is the Minister of Agriculture in South Africa right now. I assert that this claim that there's persecution of Afrikaner farmers is completely specious. Are you aware ever during the apartheid era in South Africa did the United States establish a special program to allow South African blacks who were treated as second-class citizens in the apartheid program, a special program that they could claim refugee status in the United States?
No, because I was probably in 9th grade or 8th grade at the time.
Yeah, well, then I don't expect you to know. I'll just tell you, never has there been a special program for Africans to come in as refugees to the United States. We've allowed special programs for people being persecuted for their religion, Soviet-era Jews. We've allowed special programs for people fleeing from communism, Cuba, Vietnam, the Soviet Union. We've never allowed a special program to allow Africans into the United States in an expedited refugee status until now. Afrikaner farmers living in a nation governed by a government of national unity that includes the main Afrikaner Party.
That was a great point by Tim Kaine. You know,
yes,
unfortunately failed vice presidential candidate. But just I'd love to get your thoughts on this this particular exchange on the Senate floor with Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State of the United States. For those who are not familiar, he's also a former senator from the state of Florida, and also former presidential candidate himself. Little Marco is what Trump used to call him. Anyway, would love your thoughts on that particular exchange and what was discussed there.
Yeah, before I get into that, do you mind if I read these comments by S2 Flinch? Because I want to make sure you're heard,
yeah,
and that we're not misunderstood. S2 Flinch wrote, you need to mention that there are only 30,000 farmers. So that's still 3 times the national average murder rate. Moreover, the leading cause of murder in SA is interpersonal disputes, people killing each other, often getting into an argument. The farm killings don't follow that pattern. I think that's basically what we said, right?
Yes, exactly.
And then added maybe to something I was saying about 70% of agricultural land. You said that's not true. 70% of agricultural land, which is in the hands of private individuals, is owned by white farmers. That's about 28% of the land. Read the SA government report. Did I say it wasn't in the hands of white farmers? Or is there something, anyway?
I think you were misunderstood. I think that was the thing.
Yeah,
I think everybody watching understood what you were saying.
Okay.
I think we have one person who maybe misunderstood what you were saying, because this is in violent agreement to what you said. You said, but it sounds like it's in opposition of what you said, but it actually agrees with what you said.
Oh, okay, got it. So I want to make sure that because you're making some really good points, and I want to also acknowledge those. You said the SA government owns 17 million hectares of land. That's almost 6 times the area of Belgium. The government is refusing to transfer title deeds to the Black people. Okay, all right. Well, thank you for sharing.
Yes.
Thank you for that. I assume you're South African, and maybe not, but thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Now to this very interesting exchange between Marco Rubio and Senator Kaine. I do want to say, did you see the difference? Obviously, Marco Rubio is also as assertive as Trump is. I guess no wonder they work well together. Seemingly, some people will say that's a huge that might be dangerous. If they ever disagree, it'll be a problem, just as people say Trump and Elon, but I'm digressing. But anyway, you see the way Senator Kaine didn't even back down. This is not even an African man. If we're going to juxtapose that with Ramaphosa's meeting with Trump, you see a man who is not even from Africa, a white man of European descent, defending the continent. And that's the kind of energy that Africa needs. Black South Africans, it cannot be taken away the fact that they've endured centuries of brutality, and they were often excluded from asylum protections. There was no sympathy. Matter of fact, Reagan was notorious for going against things that would have favored them. It was people like, interestingly, Joe Biden, a young Joe Biden, I think it was in his 40s, that stood up and fought for the rights of Black South Africans, because it wasn't very popular to do things like that. The US maintained formal relations with South Africa for decades. The ANC was labeled a terrorist organization. Nelson Mandela himself was on a US terror watch list until 2008. But it was through grassroots pressure, including from African-American communities, churches, student activists, that the US Congress passed sanctions against that regime in 1986, finally overriding President Reagan. It was people like Joe Biden that spoke up. I'm not doing anything partisan. I'm just saying Joe did speak up, right? So shout out to Senator Kaine. His question is very valid. These are the questions we expect people, even whites, to ask. When the Black South Africans, when they were dispossessed, when they were killed, when they were exiled, you shut the door on them. But now in the US, you're opening the door for people who actually benefited from that very system. And none of this is to say that white South Africans do not deserve protection. Everybody deserves protection. They deserve dignity. They deserve safety. And this is why people are asking Trump, you flew right over Congo. There are things going on in the Tigray region. There are things going on in Sudan, South Sudan. You fly past all that and you think these are the people worthy of asylum. After, coincidentally, you canceled aid in many African countries. And all of a sudden you find this group worthy. Did you see how healthy they looked? Anyway, thank you, Senator Kaine. Oh, that I saw a meme where there was a joke where they were talking about the best looking refugees on earth, and South Africa won.
Of course. Yeah, I think you said it all, right? I mean, look, yeah, Tim Kaine, I think did a good job educating everyone in that chamber. I'm sure most people were unaware of everything that Tim Kaine spoke about. And I think he did a great job of speaking about the Democratic Alliance, which is the basically the Afrikaners in government who have been brought in. So a little bit of a quick background on the last election. And I'm speaking from this from a very, very high level, but a coalition government has to be created in order to take over your political party, to take over in South Africa. I still don't completely understand how it works, but you need to have other folks from another party join you. And Ramaphosa's ANC party, instead of getting with Julius Malema's party or even other former ANC members who have started other offshoots, he decides to partner with the Democratic Alliance, which is basically the white South African, Afrikaners, wealthy political party of South Africa. And they built the coalition government together. And as stated by Tim Kaine, the person who's the head of agriculture is someone from the DA, the Democratic Alliance. So if they were taking land from white people, he would not stand for that. This is literally someone who fits the description of the people who own the land. He literally represents those people. So I think Tim Kaine did a pretty good job of helping to express and explain that. I know it was a short clip, and he doesn't have a lot of time when they're doing these Senate committee hearings. I don't know how, I think they have 2 minutes to speak, or whatever the number of minutes is. So they don't have a lot of time allotted. But I just wanted to be clear on that's what he was saying. And I think that, it could have used a little bit more context, but I think he did a pretty good job, at least expressing why the claims that are being made by Marco Rubio and Donald Trump just are not true. And as you said, he did a much better job than the president of South Africa himself, which is crazy. We're talking about a senator from Virginia. I think Tim Kaine is from Virginia, speaking better about these refugees, quote unquote, asylum seekers, we should really say, than Marco Rubio. Little Marco, just the way he was, he threw in the borders are closed. I think he, when he's up on that stage there, he's speaking to an audience of one. This is not for everybody else watching. This is an audience of one. He's speaking specifically for his president, the president of the United States. That's the only audience he's really speaking to. And, I don't know how much Marco believes what he says, but I can just appreciate that Tim Kaine actually did fact check him and call that out, because I thought it was important. Okay. Anything else on that topic? Because I know we've talked about it, I think 3 weeks in a row, but it's interesting that Ramaphosa came to the States and met with him and did an open briefing and conversation in front of the media. I think it was important to see that exchange. Unfortunately, we didn't walk away any wiser from that particular exchange.
Yes.
Okay, so with that, I think we can shift gears a bit. We want to kind of go around the continent. There's a few other stories that we thought were important to cover this week. And specifically moving on to Libya and specifically, the situation in Libya as currently constituted. There were hundreds of protesters that took to the street of the Libyan capital demanding political change. These protests, which came on the back of heightened violence, has sparked fears of a return of a civil conflict in the country. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, right, Libya is the country that Gaddafi was the head of for a substantial amount of time, over 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. And just for context, some of the most human trafficking that happens through the continent of Africa comes through Libya. We have a employee of our family here in Sierra Leone who was trying to escape to go to Europe and was promised a way through Libya. He was actually put into a cell. They called the family and basically tried to not extort them, but basically hold him for ransom and told them if they don't pay this money, they're going to kill him. And unfortunately, we never heard from the guy again, even after money was paid. And this happens to so many people today. Libya was one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. Obviously they have a number of resources, including oil. And under the previous Democratic administration before Biden, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, Gaddafi was overthrown and unalived in public in a very violent way. I'm not going to go into the details here, but if you want to look it up, you can look it up. A couple of quick things I want to mention about what was happening in Libya under Gaddafi at the very end of his life. Anybody who went to college anywhere around the world if you were Libyan, went to college for free. If I'm not mistaken, he was paying for weddings and funerals. He lived in a tent. He said as long as his people did not have housing, he would live in a tent because he was not going to live in like a royal or a giant presidential palace if his people did not have housing. And, you know, obviously he was talking about a United States of Africa. He was the head of the African Union for a while. And, you know, obviously building a huge profile for Libya. And yeah, he was unceremoniously unalived in public in a very violent way. So just to give that background a little bit, because we're talking about a country that not too many people are familiar with. It doesn't get talked about a lot. But if you've heard the name Gaddafi, this is the country in which he was running. So I do want to play this video really quickly, and then we'll have some commentary on the other side.
The State Council has called on Libya's parliament to jointly select a new prime minister to replace the current chief, Abdelhamid Dbeibah. The High State Council, the highest political entity, has also annulled all security measures adopted by Dbeibah, claimed to be the cause of the latest upheaval. 6 government ministers have reportedly resigned in protest of Dbeibah's handling of the crisis. On Friday, mass protests engulfed the capital Tripoli, calling to sack Dbeibah's internationally recognized presidential council. One security officer was killed as protesters tried to storm into the government headquarters. These developments have followed clashes that erupted in the densely populated areas in the capital Tripoli and other cities across the country. Since the assassination of State Support Apparatus SSA Chief Abdel Ghani al-Kikli last week, a security authority established by Dbeibah's government. According to independent watchdog National Institution for Human Rights, 53 civilians were killed, including 4 females and 2 Egyptian and Nigerian residents, while 10 unidentified bodies were found. The UN has called for calm. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibah is fighting back, accusing rivals of destabilizing the country. He defended the SSA, claiming it has created enemies while successfully retaining security. The next couple of days could be critical, as the High State Council has set a 48-hour deadline to appoint an interim prime minister and government. If current Prime Minister Dbeibah and his armed allies resist this decision, then the North African nation could be up for an even more violent and chaotic period ahead. Yes, Hakeem for CGTN.
So yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention before we went to that video was, you know, the United States has said for at least the last 20 years that we do not believe in regime change, and we do not believe in involving ourselves in foreign countries and helping to overthrow governments. Although, as you know, we do. And you'll notice that in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and anytime the United States takes its hands and meddles in a foreign country with regime change, that country ends up in a much worse place than it was with the leader that the United States did not agree with. Look at Iraq. I mean, that's a perfect example. Afghanistan as well. The Taliban is now running Afghanistan. And then look with Libya, you could see what's happening there now. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. I should have said that before we played the video, but I did want to mention that. Gloria, your thoughts on what's happening in Libya right now and what was discussed in this particular video with this assassination and the other killings that happened?
Yeah, you know, Libya is basically split into 2. Rival militias in Libya have so much power and influence. The GNU, the Government of National Unity, relies on these militias for security, and this has made it very hard to establish a unified national military force. Now, this recent violence did spark protests, and people are now, you know, as we know now, demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Dbeibah. I struggle with pronouncing his name, Dbeibah. But a lot of demonstrators are accusing his government of corruption, and they're accusing him of failing to deliver on promises to stabilize Libya, to have democratic elections. And 3 ministers ended up resigning in solidarity with the protesters. We cannot deny the Muammar Gaddafi factor. You know, following the 2011 NATO-backed uprising, which you referenced, that led to the ousting and his death. we can't deny that Libya has since descended into a state of lawlessness and division. And even Obama expressed regret. He said if there was one thing he regretted was, the fact that they didn't even have a plan for Libya. They didn't think it through, that decision they made. A lot of factions, a lot of militias keep vying for control. And this has led to 2 civil wars. It's led to the establishment of rival governments in the East and in the West. And in spite of a UN brokered ceasefire in 2020, the formation of the GNU in 2021, the country still remains deeply divided, and the conflicts just seem to never want to stop. And in all of this, the African Union is saying, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union is saying they're going to be meeting to discuss this situation and see if there are options to help Libya finally, have peace and stability. Libya is a huge reflection of what happens when the West interferes in African affairs. Hello, Joe. Okay, looks like we lost Joe. I'm going to pause and take some comments. Y'all know how we do. All right. S2 Flinch, again, I appreciate your contribution. Babs, you wrote greetings to you all there, moderators and chat. Hello, Babs. Alyssa Mitchell wrote blessings tuning in. We appreciate you tuning in. Farkan Ali, you wrote the president of South Africa should have given him a brief history of apartheid. In fact, he should have declined the offer to even come to DC. I absolutely agree with that. And that was why I said I was shocked that he even agreed to go to the lion's den. Like, why would you even agree to go to that? Keenan Mitchell, those emojis are very questionable, but okay. Maybe that was in response to what we're talking about, definitely not to us. Babs, you wrote, why doesn't Mr. Trump help to stop the genocide going on in Congo against the Hutus right now as we are talking? And you added, there's another genocide going on too in Sudan. Why doesn't he help those countries in need? And I don't know if you're aware, but Trump did mediate or try to mediate. Again, Marco Rubio was there, tried to mediate the conflict between the DRC and Rwanda. America had to step in, which was very questionable because we addressed that a few weeks ago. Why is America yet again involved in African affairs? Keenan Mitchell wrote, yes, Ramaphosa should have asked him to take refuge. Okay, I don't know what that is in reference to, bear with me. And you added, South African president should have asked Trump to take refugees, okay, from Sudan, the DRC, Tigray. I absolutely agree. You see what I mean? Like those are the kinds of points we were hoping Rama would make, but we can only wish. So Joe, let us know when you get back. You look frozen. So let me keep.
I'm back now. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Am I? Okay.
Welcome back.
All right. There's a little bit of a delay. Yes. Thank you. There's a bit of a delay. So sorry about that, guys. My internet has been interneting. Okay. So, so I think we talked a lot about what was happening in Libya and what's and I think this leads very well into the next story, because we've talked about some of the policies of the current administration in the United States. And again, we don't want this live stream to be all about the administration of the United States, but there's always a story about how the US and African relations are souring as time goes on. Literally every week, there's a new story about how the US and some country in Africa has some kind of dispute. And so we just think it's important that we talk about it, because many of you who are watching this are spending time and or living in the US. And we think that this has a global impact. So with that, there are reports that there is a possibility of Palestinians being shipped off to Libya. And I want to give a little bit of context and insight into what exactly I mean by that. because I don't know how many people are aware of this story. In the last 3 days, it has become apparent that the Trump administration is working on a plan to permanently move 1 million Palestinians to Libya. So we just watched a story about how Libya is not such a stable country at this point in time. And it's not, first of all, it's not even the home of Palestinians anyway, but to move Palestinians there because, you know, obviously because the administration of the United States, the current administration just thinks that if a certain group of people look like each other, we should all go there. So all the Africans and should go to, you know, to Rwanda, all the Latin Americans should go to Venezuela, and all the Palestinians should go to Libya. So real quick, you know, just some background. The Trump administration, like I said, is working on a plan to permanently relocate up to 1 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Libya. 5 people with knowledge of the effort had told NBC. The plan was under serious enough consideration that the administration had discussed it with Libya's leadership. 2 people with direct knowledge mentioned. In exchange for resettlement of Palestinians, the administration would potentially release to Libya billions of dollars of funds that the U.S. froze more than a decade ago. No final agreement has been reached, and Israel has been kept informed of the administration's discussions with those same 3 sources. The State Department and the National Security Council did not respond to requests from NBC and others. But let's go to this video, and we will have some commentary on the other side. We'll leave it at that because for those of you who are, you know, just listening in the background, it's all video and text on screen, and we gave a lot of that context before the video. So Gloria, I mean, just your thoughts on this, the new process for the potential, and it's actually not funny actually at all, yeah. But the potential for the resettlement of these Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Libya.
Yeah, and Libyan officials, by the way, have actually denied this claim, but the rumor is still out there. And this is not the first time that something like this will happen. In the early 1950s, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency initiated a program to help move 2,500 Palestinian refugees to Libya. And Britain suggested this, by the way, and Libya gave its approval. However, in the mid-1990s, Libya ended up expelling thousands of Palestinians, reducing their population in Libya from 30,000 to 17,000. So Libya, as I pointed out, is split into 2. It's divided between the government of national unity in Tripoli and the Libyan National Army in the east. And again, they have a lot of militias controlling different regions. So with this fragmentation that's going on in Libya, if this was even to happen, you know, it's raised a lot of concerns about how feasible this is, how safe, you know, will these refugees be? Because if you're talking about relocating a large population of refugees to Libya, safety is extremely crucial. And how do Palestinians feel about this? A lot of leaders, Palestinian leaders and communities are opposing any form of forced relocation. They view it as an attempt to undermine their rights to return to their homeland. Many Palestinians are saying that this reminds them of the 1948 Nakba, which actually led to the displacement of approximately 700,000 Palestinians. Any proposal that looks similar to any past displacement or past displacement is likely to be met with strong resistance, and that's understandable. And I mean, in conclusion, while you know the reports of a U.S. plan to relocate Palestinians to Libya seem to have surfaced, you know, there have been denials officially, and historical precedents are suggesting that it's highly questionable. I don't think it will happen, but I think we should keep our eyes on that one.
Yeah, well put. You know, a lot of things get leaked and then don't come to fruition. They throw a lot of ideas at the wall and see what sticks, right? That is the thing that they do. They flood the zone and they throw out a lot of ideas. So we will see. We'll keep you guys posted on the story.
Yes.
Because I think you know, it's important to know what is potentially to come. Okay, so with that, I think we want to switch gears now over to Tanzania, or Tanzania, depending on who you are and what part of the world you're from. Tomato, right? So they're facing growing insecurity or scrutiny as a trial of opposition leader Tundu Lissu fuels concerns about a potential slide into authoritarian rule. The 57-year-old, a prominent figure of an opposition party, faces charges of treason, a crime that carries the death penalty in Tanzania. He was arrested in April for allegedly inciting Tanzanians to disrupt the upcoming presidential elections in October, from which his party is barred from participating. The current president's administration is now under intense criticism for what many perceive as a systematic erosion of civil liberties and the deployment of heavy-handed tactics to silence dissent. She is also under fire for a crackdown on his external supporters as well. Kenyan activists were barred from showing their solidarity with Lissu in court and deported from Tanzania shortly after their arrival. Among them were Kenya's former Chief Justice, an ex-Justice Minister, and many human rights activists. So the situation in Tanzania reflects a troubling trend in East Africa. Ugandan's opposition leader also faces treason charges and the lead up to a January 2026 presidential election. You know, transnational repression is rising, with opposition figures pursued across East African borders, abducted and imprisoned back home. So, you know, without further ado, let's just get right into the video. We're going to have some commentary on the other side.
Dictatorship? That's the worry in people's minds amid the treason trial of opposition leader Tundu Lissu. The 57-year-old could face the death penalty if convicted. Lissu was arrested in April 2025 over an alleged call for disruptions to October's general elections, from which his Chadema party is barred. President Samia Suluhu Hassan is accused of curtailing civil liberties and using heavy-handed tactics to silence the opposition. She alleges foreign meddling.
Kuna majaribio kadhaa. Niwaombe sana vyombo vya ulinzi na usalama na nyinyi wasimamizi wa sera zetu nje kutoa nafasi kwa watovu wa adabu wa nchi nyingine kuja kutovuka hapa kwetu. Hapana.
Kenya's former Chief Justice, human rights advocates, and an ex-justice minister were deported after arriving in Tanzania to support Lissu in court. In neighboring Uganda, opposition leader Kizza Besigye is also facing treason charges. It scuppered his hopes for the January 2026 presidential election. With opposition leaders branded traitors, some say elections in East Africa are turning into an empty political ritual. Tanzania historically supported liberation movements under Pan-African leader Julius Nyerere. That legacy could now be under threat from growing authoritarianism.
So, Gloria, what are your thoughts? We've spoken about her in previous live streams.
Yes.
So now, here's where we are. So I'd love your thoughts.
Thank you. And I'm such a, I'm a big fan of people or opposition leaders throughout the continent who dare to speak truth to power and challenge, situations that have put Africa where it is. Of course, Senegal, Usman Sonko, I'm such a fan. Bobby Wine of Uganda, I'm such a fan. Peter Obi of Nigeria, I'm such a fan. Yeah, quote me, because these are people who consistently, regardless of the threats, speak truth to power. Malema, whether or not you agree with his party, is somebody worthy of admiration because this is the man now, and that's why some people said Malema should have been the one to face Trump. This is a man who is bold and he speaks. He does not care. You know what it takes to actually speak truth to power? You're mental. You know what I mean? You're literally putting your life on the line. So in Tanzania, for me, it's Tundu Lissu. Is somebody I actually admire. Now, somebody had written on this platform that he's actually a puppet of the West, and I will address that in just a bit. But just to give some historical background on Tundu, because he's not new to this. In 2010, he actually got involved in politics under the Chadema party. And then shortly after, he became a leading opposition figure because he's extremely outspoken. He criticizes the government's policies and alleged corruption. And this activism led to multiple arrests. And matter of fact, in 2017, there was an assassination attempt where he was shot 16 times. This is not a hip hop song. This man was shot 16 times. And after his recovery, he went into exile in Belgium. Now, in 2010, he returned to Tanzania to contest the presidential elections, but went back into exile following the elections due to safety concerns. 3 years later, 2023, he returned again, citing a more open political environment, thinking that President Samia Hassan was more open. However, in April 2025, just last month, he was arrested and charged with treason after calling for electoral reforms. There's a slogan that he's made popular: "No reforms, no election." And they've criticized this, saying that he's coming for the government, and they've accused him of being a Western puppet. And I'm sure that's also because he has the backing of human rights organizations. They said, why would you actually clamp down on somebody saying that or somebody calling for reforms for an election? Throughout Africa, we need reforms to our elections. Now to that comment about him being a puppet of the West. A lot of government officials, a lot of supporters of the ruling party have actually put that out there. And there are two reasons for this. One, Tundu studied abroad, and then he gets support from international human rights organizations. But the irony is that Tundu himself constantly advocates for Tanzanian sovereignty and keeps asking for democratic reforms. The situation going on in Tanzania is so tense. I've expressed my disappointment with the president. I wish, a woman in power, like girl, this could have been extremely historic, but you're doing so. I mean, what would encourage us to have more female leaders step up? You know what I mean? And that's why I compared her with the other female president, who is the only second female president on the continent in Namibia, and how hopefully she stayed, because and even same thing for opposition. You just never know who may come in and then do something differently after they're in power. And this Bobby Wine actually said this. Uganda's Bobby Wine said this, that's one of his fears. So he has a group to check him and make sure he's grounded. But this arrest of Lissu and even the deportation, because they had foreign activists coming in to support him, they were deported. Make it make sense.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just add one thing, and you mentioned this as well. I think when you have a person of any protected class or minority group who steps into a position of power, they now set the precedent for everyone else who comes afterwards, whether that be someone else who has to live up to that, or whether or not other people will then say, we don't want another one of that, so we're not voting for anyone who looks like that, right? And in this case, we're talking about a woman who was, highly touted and respected, was obviously called you know, some progression in East Africa, seeing a woman running the country there. And, you know, but I don't think it matters what protected class you come from if you are not operating within the best interest of your country. And so I think that that's something that we'll have to follow and see what ends up happening. I mean, if he's, you know, this punishable by death, being, you know, labeled a traitor. So I guess we'll see what happens with the opposition leaders, what evidence they can bring against them. And if she actually does end up having free and fair elections in her country. And we will continue to keep you guys posted on whether that does happen or doesn't. Okay, with that, that was the Tanzania story. And then lastly, we will head over to Angola, or specifically Gabon, actually. So Gabon's ousted former president Ali Bongo has now flown to Angola with his wife and son, who you guys might remember when he was saying, make noise, make noise. We played the video a couple weeks ago.
I know you would say, gotta go back to that.
Of course. He mentioned his son in that, because he was held, you know, in, you know, after they overthrew the government, he was basically held captive in, was it a hotel, or, yeah, I think it was in a hotel. And so, yeah, so he is now flown to Angola with his wife and son, who had been freed almost 2 years ago after being detained following the coup, Angola's presidency said on Friday. So with that, let's get into the video and have some commentary on the other side. Let's see.
Transferred from prison to house arrest last week, Gabon's former president Ali Bongo arrived in Angola early Friday, along with his wife and son, who had been provisionally freed awaiting the pair's trial for alleged embezzlement.
I would like to make it clear that this measure, this decision to grant provisional release, in no way interrupts the normal course of the proceedings, which will continue until a fair, transparent and timely trial is held.
The release of the family followed talks between the Angolan president and Gabon's new leader, General Brice Oligui Nguema. Oligui, a former junta leader, seized power in the oil-rich country in a coup in 2023 that ended the Bongo dynasty's 55-year rule.
I'm Ali Bongo Ondimba, president of Gabon, and I'm to send a message to all the friends that we have all over the world to tell them to make noise,
Bongo came to power in 2009, taking over from his father, Omar Bongo Ondimba. In 2016, he was narrowly re-elected for a second term, beating opposition challenger Jean Ping after a campaign marred by bloody clashes and allegations of fraud. During their years in power, the Bongo family had been accused of accumulating immense wealth for themselves at the expense of the country, allegations they deny. The UN says despite its oil wealth, a third of its population of 2.3 million lives below the poverty line.
Thoughts on Ali Bongo going to Angola?
Do you think he'll make noise in Angola? I don't have like a favorite tagline. I mean, I guess Nguema had to, you know, they're cousins. You know, I mean, it's a small population in Gabon, so perhaps everybody's related to somebody, or the chances of you being related to your neighbor is, you know, the chances are very high. But this was a man who was very corrupt. He was known for electoral fraud. He was known for human rights abuses. And in 2023, a lot of people supported Gabon. The people were happy to see him out of power, you know, and of course, that was when he asked all of us to make noise. I think Job may have made some noise for him. But anyway, now him being in Angola reminds me of Compaoré, who was behind the death of Thomas Sankara, you know, being given relief and, you know, being exiled in Côte d'Ivoire. Sese Seko, who was behind the death of Patrice Lumumba, fled to Morocco. You know, it's Mugabe. Well, this might be a sensitive one, so I'm going to tread very softly. But after Mugabe was ousted, he was granted immunity and he was allowed to remain in the country, which I think is even more fair. But in all of this, Seseseko and Compaore, at least, for instance, and people like them, why isn't there ever accountability? If after everything you do, after all the atrocious things you do, I mean, I just cited examples of people who were behind the death of two of Africa's biggest heroes. They got away with it in a sense because all they got was they were allowed to be. Who are these countries even taking these people? And the AU, by the way, was the mediator of all this. See, the AU can be very active, but I would like more action in areas that I think are even more urgent. Ali Bongo's family enjoyed Gabon's wealth for 55 years.
Right.
Okay. And some may say this is great for reconciliation, for stability, but what does accountability look like? You know, there were alleged crimes committed during their tenure. How do we make an example of bad leaders in Africa? Because I mean, look at Asia. We've seen what has been done in different countries in Asia. When a government who has been accused of corruption, we see the extreme measures they take. But in Africa, you get to go on vacation for life.
Right.
And of course, it's Angola. I think I'll rest my case here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree 100%. I think the idea that they find refuge in other countries, as you said, who are these countries that are allowing them to come there after they've basically destroyed their country, you know, by operating in a coup against someone who was focused on improving the country. Now, in this case, with Gabon, as you mentioned, he was obviously very corrupt. It is his cousin. And so that's not the specific case here in terms of someone who has been focused on improving the country, is focused on enriching himself. But yeah, I think this is another story that we'll just have to watch and see what happens. But it looks like there's going to be a trial that's going to happen in absentia. And so even if he's convicted, good luck getting him back. You know, to stand trial. So yeah, we'll follow the story and we'll keep you guys posted. You know, this is one that we wanted to keep you guys aware of because we had talked about, you know, Ali Bongo a couple of weeks ago, and we did do a recent update on what had been happening in the months since, you know, well, in the last couple of months, because it's been a while since the coup. So with that, there's some stories from around the continent that we want to just kind of give you maybe the headlines of, and something that you guys can pay attention and do some research on and check out what's going on there. And so okay. So some of those stories is, okay, so the UN backs Equatorial Guinea in disputed land claim with Gabon. Speaking of Gabon, any thoughts on this particular story? Any context you want to give?
Sure. This decision was actually based on a treaty from 1900 between Spain and France, which basically it rejects Gabon's claim based on their on a 1974 Bada Convention. So basically, the ruling is mandating that Gabon withdraws its military forces from the islands, and this has been a point of contention since the 1970s. So yeah, this, I guess, is significant for Equatorial Guinea because the islands are located in very oil-rich waters, and that's actually necessary for or very crucial for their economy.
Yeah, Guinea made a lot of noise in the last 12 months. You can check that out if you're interested in wild, salacious stories from Central Africa. Okay, so also charges have been dropped against the widow of former Rwandan president accused of being part of those who caused the genocide against the Tutsis. Any thoughts on that story?
Yeah, the widow of President Habyarimana. She's been under investigation actually in France since 2007. She's been accused of complicity in the 1994 Rwandan, the genocide. Please, Rwandans, forgive me if I don't phrase this correctly. I have to literally memorize because I don't want to offend you. But the genocide on Rwandan Tutsis in 1994. And the Paris Judicial Court has concluded that the prosecution's testimony wasn't consistent, that it was contradictory, so they closed the entire investigation. But it's not a final decision, though, because the prosecution and civil parties are still able to appeal.
Got it. Great insight. What I'll say here is we will keep you guys abreast of what's going on. And then our last and final story in Nigeria, a very sad story about you know, a Nigerian student who sadly took their life. Can we talk about this story a bit? I think this is an important one to cover. We wanted to make sure we covered it, at least as a headline and a little bit of context for those who aren't aware of the story itself.
Yeah, Nigeria's Joint Admissions and Matriculation Board, JAMB is what we call it in Nigeria, had a technical glitch that ended up compromising the results of exams. And imagine the student distress, that because JAMB is like, it's like, whoa, you need JAMB to basically get into university, and JAMB is notoriously difficult and challenging. There are students who have to rewrite them every year just to be able to, you know, finally make enough of a grade to get into school. And people have said this was politically motivated. Some people have accused the government or the board of targeting a certain region of Nigeria. They say, how come there were so many people from the East? I know Nigeria has the tension between the East and states in the Southwest, Yoruba, Igbo, and they felt it was, you know, targeting a certain ethnic group. And in all of this, sadly, a 19-year-old girl from Lagos, Timileyin Okpesusi, actually took her own life. She took her life after she scored 190. And 190, she believed was not enough for her to gain admission. Ironically, there are reports that actually say she did gain admission 30 minutes after her death. But the National Association of Nigerian Students has been very vocal about this, asking for accountability. That was such an expensive mistake to make. I know how JAMB can be like, literally it feels like, oh, you know, this is the bridge right here between your past and your future. And for that to have happened, it's such an expensive mistake, and it's just so unfair.
Absolutely. And you know, and you specifically, but we all know how much Nigerians value education. Yes. And, you know, what is it? We did carry first, we don't carry last. Is that, I don't know. I always mess up your Nigerian phrases, but I mean, there's always a sense of pride of being top of your class, being the best of the best, and around education. And so you can see how something like this, you know, a score that is a score that, you know, falsely reported, and a lower score than what you obviously were anticipating. You spent all this time studying to take this exam. It kind of reminds me maybe like the SATs in the US, even though I don't know if the SATs are any longer required. But yeah, I mean, it seems like a very similar structure to what's there in the United States. Sad story, and you know, we'll see if there is ever a correction made. With that, that concludes the stories for the week. Any final words or thoughts, Gloria?
We appreciate you all for your wonderful comments and contribution. Please follow us on all socials at authentic_African on every single social. He's everywhere. And so am I at the Gloria Ayo. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you next week so we can have more enlightening conversations.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to it as well. And I want to thank everybody for watching. Those of you who are watching and found this useful, make sure you hit that thumbs up. If you know anybody who could use this insight, make sure you share it with them. And as Gloria mentioned, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're notified every time a video comes out. Shout out to Jada for throwing out a note.
Thank you, Jada. That made me smile so big.
I saw that. That's why I put it up on the screen. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We will see you guys all next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.